Administrator of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, or OJJDP. And I want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon for what is going to be a truly engaging conversation. And we believe it's a once-in-a-generation type conversation. So as we at OJJDP continue to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, also known as the JJDPA, we have brought together former administrators from the office who have collectively and, yes, they have collectively and singularly focused on the future of youth justice. And today marks an historic convergence of leadership and experience in youth justice reform. So also in the room, we have many colleagues from OJJDP, current and former staff. We also have colleagues from across the Department of Justice, and I want to recognize Director Chris Rose from the Office for Victims of Crime for being with us. And we have many youth justice stakeholders in the room. I see so many faces I know, and I'm so excited that you all are here. We also have partners from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, from AmeriCorps, and other partners in the work on Office for Violence Against Women as well. So thank you for joining us. I want to thank our distinguished panel of 8 former administrators. Not only have they been extraordinary leaders for youth justice reform, but they are pioneers. They have challenged the status quo, they've explored new paths, and they've significantly altered the landscape. Their efforts have played a crucial role in championing the JJDPA's core principles and advocating for policies that promote the fair treatment of youth in the justice system. And I will say that they have continued to advance youth justice many, many years after serving as OJJDP administrator, by sharing their wisdom and expertise with the field, with our office, and I'm just grateful that many of them continue to take my phone calls as I've been in this role. OJJDP's mission ahead is to build on the solid groundwork that's already been laid by this group, while recognizing that our journey is far from over. The transformations our youth justice system has already undergone not only continue, but evolve. Historically, as many of you know, the treatment of young people who came into conflict with the law was harsh and unforgiving. Many children were incarcerated alongside adults, exposing them to environments that were not only unsafe, but damaging to their emotional and physical well-being. Prior to the passage of the JJDPA, data on youth incarceration was not formally tracked, but a 1976 Children's Defense Fund report estimates that up to 500,000 children were in adult jails every year. The juvenile justice system was once predominantly punitive, dismissing the critical potential for rehabilitation. However, as society's understanding of child development has grown, so too has our approach to youth justice. Today, we embrace the idea that youth are capable of change. We recognize that young people can learn from their mistakes. We know that young people can be responsible, contributing members of society. In recent years, many states have undertaken proactive steps to foster meaningful reforms. For instance, some states have raised the age at which young people can be processed in the juvenile justice system, recognizing that treating youth in a rehabilitative and supportive environment can lead to more positive outcomes. There's also been a call for alternatives to out-of-home placements, and community-based approaches are now the hallmark of modern youth justice. By keeping youth connected to their families and communities, we can help them get back on track and improve community safety.
I enjoyed it immensely, and I'm looking forward to trying to squeeze in as much information to you guys as I can.
My name is John Rector. We live in Lake Ridge, Virginia. We were just chatting about 3 children here. Most of the speeches or participants I've been in, they've seen on television. They've never been present when I was doing something like this. So special day for me.
I'm Bob Flores. I was administrator from 2002 to 2009 during the Bush administration, and My wife and I are now empty nesters. Many of you who I worked with remember my children coming to different events. They're all out of the house now. So I'm old. I just joined Medicare. So.
Good afternoon. I'm Jeff Slowakowski, and I know many of you because I worked with many of you, having started in 1990 with OJJDP and spent 29 years there. Currently still with OJP, and my final chapter hasn't been written yet, so I may end up back in OJJDP one day. I was acting administrator from 2009 to 2012, I think. Yes, 3 years. So thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Bob Listenby. I was administrator of OJJDP from 2013 years. And after leaving OJJDP, I became a prosecutor where I've worked as first assistant district attorney in Philadelphia for the last 6.5 years. So I've had a career that has placed me in different situations. One comment I would make is one of the more interesting moments of my time with OJJDP was when chief counsel for OJP came to my office and said, "Look, Bob, you're in trouble. The Attorney General is being sued, and he's being sued because of you. There was a person who filed for a grant, and there was a misplaced comma, and you denied them an opportunity to pursue the grant." I looked at him. This is all in the newspaper by then. I smiled and I said, "No, you're wrong. I told my staff that they could not disqualify that person, and I was thinking about my mother, who told me I'd be a fool if I did something like that." So, so a pleasure to be here and meet and see many of you for the first time, but see many old friends as well.
Hi, my name is Cheryl Jones. I've been with OJDP since 1998, and I was the acting administrator from January 2021 to May of 2022. And it's good to see so many familiar faces. Thanks for joining us today.
That was great. That was great. And so you're probably wondering, why wasn't Shay up there? So we were here earlier, and they voted me off the island. I mean, you know, fellow administrators, and boom, you're gone, just like that. It's so good to be back. I know it's a new building, but it still feels like you're back. Earlier today, there was a staff meeting for OJJDP staff, and Frank Cohen's is here, commending the staff on the amazing work that they do, and describing the red books. I don't know, are they still red books? What color are they now? They red? Different color. Used to be red. But it was a PTSD moment for me.
Is it not on again? Okay. I assume you all heard that. Totally PTSD, because when it came to the final grant books that came forward and you needed to sign, what Brent was describing wasn't visual enough, because you have hundreds and hundreds of these books stacked on your desk, and you can't say to someone, "Can I take these home with me?" You know, you've got to stay in the office to go ahead and do them. So that was my PTSD moment. I'm still recovering right now, but it feels okay. I'm going to get on with the panel, guys. Don't worry. We're going to get there in a minute. But I also wanted to just mention that Eileen Gary was supposed to be here. She was an acting administrator as well. She's very ill right now. So I want to send her our wishes and prayers that she has a speedy recovery and that she's able to rejoin the office soon and get back on her feet. So I wanted to share that with all of you. So I have been designated as the moderator for this panel, which is the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So our first three people here. I was here in the 90s, but they've actually put me on the next panel. So I'm going to have a chance for more substantive input a little bit later, but for now, you're going to have Ira and John being the recipient of my questions. Firewall, Bob, from you, okay? So this is like the impossible. How do you cover 3 decades in 20 to 25 minutes? We're also going to open it up for questions from the audience after the 20 to 25 minutes to give you an opportunity to make inquiry of these people, including John Rector's children. You know, not only you get to see them in action, you get to put them on the spot for a change, right? Isn't this the best of all worlds? All right, so I'm going to start with a question for all of you, and start with John Rector, and then I'll turn it over to Ira and John. But I want you to share what sparked your interest in the juvenile or youth justice system and how that has shaped your career moving forward. And I'll turn to you first, Ira.
Thank you.
I'll turn it first to John.
I was the administrator from 77, 2 years later, 79. But what really focused me on juvenile justice and an overwhelming dire need for reform was when I was at Berkeley in the School of Criminology. And I had a teaching assistant who was writing a book. And we had a small group meeting every week and a large group every week as well. His name was Anthony Platt. And he was actually rehearsing through those years the drafts of his chapters. But his book was something called The Child Savers, The Invention of Delinquency. And believe me, it was a very harsh, somewhat unbalanced critique of the juvenile justice system. So that got me queued up for a lot of years. And I should add, during law school, I lived in San Francisco, and I volunteered at the Huckleberry House, which was a runaway program that had been developed during the Flower Child period, 68, 72. They would see as many as 5,000 kids during that period. I volunteered to do lectures like what to do if you're about to get arrested. You teach the kids what to do and what not to do. So those two experiences I recall, particularly Anthony Platt's book, got me focused.
Great, thank you, John. Ira?
Yes, thank you. First, I want to thank Liz and her staff for arranging this anniversary forum. I mean, it really is a historic event. And the office has had just tremendous accomplishments over the years. And all of you should be proud of really what's been accomplished. And for your current staff, I want to just tell you how fortunate you are to have somebody like Brent Cohn in your corner. I didn't know him. I just met him today and had a chance to hear his opening remarks. And this guy understands the field, and he understands why OJJDP is important. And it's important to have an assistant attorney general in your corner. It certainly never hurts. And I'm really glad to hear about all the fine work that the staff are doing. I mean, I've followed the office over the years, and so I've been aware of many of the things that you've done. But this is my opportunity to say thank you for all you've done. I was in the juvenile and adult criminal justice field before I was nominated by President Carter to head the office. And after I became administrator, that's really when I sort of got tagged for being in the juvenile field. And I continued to stay in the field after I left. I became a professor at the University of Minnesota and also at the University of Michigan, a professor of social work. And then I became dean of the School of Social Work at the University of Pennsylvania, and then subsequently provost at Temple University. One of the things that Brent Cohn mentioned about the office is that the office has always been at the cutting edge of what needs to be done in the field to advance the cause for children in this country. And one of the things that's in its infancy, but clearly is on the horizon, and will probably explode over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, is the application of artificial intelligence to juvenile justice and child welfare. There are some jurisdictions that are beginning to experiment with this, and I can tell you that this is going to be something that's going to have a profound impact on the field in a very positive way. Now, there could be some negatives, obviously, associated with this, but I think if this is managed properly, it'll be a huge development in the field. And I think the office, being the innovator and being at the cutting edge, as Brent Cohn mentioned, I think could play an important role in helping to manage this process and to help implement it. It's probably going to have a bigger impact on the child welfare field. And it should, because that field is in serious trouble, as I think many of you know. And it'll have a significant impact in juvenile justice as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ira. John?
My interest, I was originally a social worker in Detroit, did that for 8 years with ADC mothers and families, and then I ran a job development and community works program after the riots in Detroit. And I had been been able to read about a speech that Don Cenarelli, who was then the administrator of LEAA, gave, and that piqued my interest in criminal justice. And in addition to that, I had a client whose husband was in prison for a robbery, and she told me that he was innocent, that he hadn't done that. And of course, like most people, everybody's innocent, right? It turned out he was innocent. Somebody else confessed to that robbery, and he was freed after 2 years in prison. And I thought that was a real injustice for that to happen to a family with a mother and a couple of little kids. So when I got an opportunity to come to work at the Department of Justice under the honors program, I picked LEAA as one of my target agencies and got hired by LEAA. So I came out there, and as John will tell you, the JJ Act was being put together. And I had the privilege of working on the Hill with John and his staff on the statute. And I was tabbed from then on as the juvenile justice guy in the Office of General Counsel and in OJP. So it was an extremely great ride for 31 years. I enjoyed it immensely.
So that introduction is a perfect segue to the next question, which is the context for the act. What was the political environment? What were the perspectives on juvenile justice and youth justice when the act was contemplated as a necessity? So I'm going to turn to John Rector first, talking about that political environment and how you navigated it.
I think of it on two levels, the national environment, and I just think of Watergate, Vietnam War, Civil Rights Movement, and in the Senate, where I was chief counsel to Senator Birch Bayh. I was with him for 7 years, and we were always very busy, but 74 was an especially busy period. And we were dancing around the Watergate issue. We the same year that we did the JD Act, we did 3 other public laws. We had hearings on 4 different national subjects. But what really was behind the juvenile justice was the litigation that was going on around the country, particularly in Texas and Indiana. And one of my closest friends, John Forehand, brought the Indiana case, the Nelson versus Haney. And the judge in that case and in a similar case in Texas had held the system in the state, the juvenile system, to violate the 8th Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment, as well as the 14th Amendment. A very similar outcome had come in Texas with Judge William Justice. And in both cases, they established the right to treatment for juveniles. And in both cases, they were very hostile to the concept of status offenders being treated like they had committed a crime. Those were sort of the driving forces. And there were also about a dozen highly publicized books and exposés about the juvenile justice system. One of them was Weeping in the Playtime of Others by Ken Wooden. And I mentioned him, and he's been, up until a year ago when he passed away, a lifelong friend. But Birch Bayh got to know him in 1964 at the Democratic Convention. And they got sort of hooked at the hip on the subject of juvenile justice. And Ken had a lot to do with what we eventually did.
Great. Thank you, John.
And-
Ira, John Wilson, please add.
Yeah, from the agency perspective, LEAA had been created in 1968 as part of Lyndon Johnson's War on Crime. And so by the time we got to 1974, LEAA was a $500 million grant program to address criminal justice issues. And I think that it's fair to say that the senators felt like they could use LEAA's grant delivery system to deliver juvenile justice funding to state and local governments. JJDPA and HEW, with the Youth Development and Delinquency Prevention Administration, had been appropriated, as I recall, $4 million to implement juvenile justice and delinquency prevention programming, only spent $2 million and reverted the rest of it to the Treasury. And that was not didn't make the Senate happy. So the Senate pushed for moving the juvenile justice program from HEW to the Justice Department. I was sent up on Capitol Hill to work with John, as I said before, and his staff, and I'll tell you a little more about that later, but that was kind of where we came from the Department of Justice side.
So it was by a driver at this point as a vehicle, a conduit to get something done?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Okay, Ira?
Yep.
When I was nominated by President Carter, and before I actually assumed office, what I did was I reached out to about a half a dozen really prominent and well-known juvenile justice practitioners around the country. And they were kind of a kitchen cabinet for me. And I basically asked them, what do you think I should do when I, hopefully when I get confirmed? And interestingly, they all told me the same thing. They said, pick the one or two things that you think are really important. Now, granted, the office is going to be doing lots of different things, but what do you want the legacy of the office to be? And I thought a lot about that. And as Liz mentioned earlier, around that time, there were 500,000 kids a year who were being held in adult jails. And a hell of a lot of them were girls. And they were being held there for having the common sense to run away from abusive homes. And in those days, jails were not built to house kids. And so the legislation that was passed originally that created the act said you had to keep juveniles separate from adults. And so what that meant is that more often than not, kids were held in drunk tanks, isolation cells. There was an enormous rate of suicide in adult jails. So I decided that, well, if I got confirmed, then for the 1980 reauthorization, I would try to get an amendment passed to get kids out of adult jails. And so shortly after I took office and I decided to do that, a fellow came to visit me, and he was the chief of police of one of the Native American reservations. And he came to see me, and he sat down in my office and he said, I want to tell you a story. And I got a call one day, and one of my deputies said that my son had got arrested. I think for disorderly conduct, or may have been drunkenness, I can't remember. And they said, what do you want us to do with him? And he said, well, let him spend the night in jail. Well, that night, the kid committed suicide. And that sealed the deal for me, that there was no question that we were going to do this. And the Attorney General, Ben Civiletti, was my boss at the time. I had to convince to support this. And it wasn't a difficult task. He understood immediately. But Jimmy Carter lost the election. And the transition team for the Reagan administration sent out a message that they didn't want any legislation passed between the election and the time the new administration took office. And what this meant was that the Juvenile Justice Act would not have been reauthorized. And if that would have happened, none of us would be sitting here today. And what happened was, after we sort of picked our chins up off the floor and realized what the implications of all this were, the office, with the help of a lot of volunteers, some of which who are not here, Marion Mattingly, for one, some of you may remember her. Mark Davis, who worked for the office, who managed the legislative affairs, was a fabulous guy. And others mobilized one of the phenomenal campaign around the country to get support to get the act reauthorized. And fortunately, a guy named Ed Meese, who was involved in the Reagan administration, subsequently became Attorney General, he was involved with the California Criminal Justice Council. And so he knew about juvenile justice. And I won't tell you how this all happened, but we basically got him to agree to allow the legislation to go through. And so that was the only piece of legislation that was passed between the time Jimmy Carter lost the election and Ronald Reagan took office. No other legislation passed except that. And that not only was it a phenomenal feat in itself, but just think of what happened in terms of children.
That's right.
Jimmy Carter called Ben Civiletti and said to him, "You struck a blow for kids."
Thank you, Ira. That's great history. So let's go back to John Rector and John Wilson. As what we're hearing today is that there's an evolution of the Act from its initial passing to building what I'll call the pillars of the Act, the way Ira was describing the reauthorization in 80, et cetera. Talk more about that, because initially, when you talked about LEA, it was becoming a grant-making program. It was creating a special grant-making program for kids, but there were pillars associated with the Act that began to develop as early as the 80 reauthorization and subsequent. What was it like to have to implement the Act? What were the steps you needed to take? Start with John Rector.
I want to back up a little bit. I wanted to mention that the first two versions of what became the JD Act were very different than the JD Act. There was a unit to be created in the White House, and it was built on a program that Nixon had done called the SAODAP, Special Action Office for Drug Abuse Prevention. And we had that in the bill up until we marked up the final bill that became the JD Act. And when we marked it up in subcommittee, it still was going to HEW. And when we went to the full committee, we lost on a vote of 8-5, and it became the LEA bill. And from a personal point of view, I was not unhappy about that at all. I had been at Justice in the criminal Civil Rights Division, and that's another area where I saw a lot of this horrible stuff going on for kids. And a lot of our staff was unhappy. They were more liberal, and they wanted HEW. And I thought of the HEW people, frankly, in an aggregate of the child saver people. So I was glad it didn't go to HEW. I wanted people to know a little something about the justice system. So when it came out of the committee, we had to do work to mesh John and Mr. Madden, the general counsel, the two bills. But my one thing, I would talk about my one thing was the status offender issue, because the courts were finding just how outrageous it was, especially as was just mentioned for young women. So you had half the young people incarcerated for up to half a year or more were young women who had not committed a crime. And the ones that had committed crime were serving far, far less lengthy terms. My boss, Birch Bayh, that was his key objective. That was one of the most outrageous things. He had done the ERA, we did Title IX. We were very focused on these kinds of issues. And we actually sort of hid that. But the broader politics of Watergate and so forth helped us, because no one really knew, maybe John knew, that in the conditions of the contract that the state would sign to participate with the JD office, they were going to have to stop doing that within 2 years. And I know I spent most of my 2 years there fighting with governors and their people, and I'd say, well, why did you sign it? And internally, people didn't really want to have to enforce it either. And so being a lawyer, a former trial lawyer, I was like, it's a contract, you signed it, they signed it, it's got to be enforced. I spent most of my time on that.
John?
Yeah, actually, we couldn't do it in 2 years, but so they kind of softened it up a little bit after that. But I will say too that Ed Meese was on our national OJJDP's National Advisory Committee, and I think we had softened him up a little bit on terms of juvenile justice. He was a very much of a hardliner, but he was really a fine gentleman, and so we worked very well with him. So I think. I really think, and I talked probably a little bit about this later, but one of our great accomplishments was the core protections, which is what we came to. We didn't call them requirements, we called them protections anymore, so get the idea across that we were protecting kids by doing these things. So that's really what I have to offer.
So John, I'm going to stick with you, and the others can jump in. I think the notion, and as John Rector described it, that, well, you signed it, we're going to enforce it. that there could have been a perception in the field, in fact there was, that this is an organization, an entity in the federal government that's about compliance. So I love the distinction you drew about core requirements versus core protections, but how did you work to present the office in a way that you were really partners with them as opposed to enforcers? And I think that's a continuing, ongoing challenge, but at those early years, how did you address that?
Well, I think one of the things we did was we worked very closely with the administration in the states and with the state advisory groups to get their input and their feedback on how we were going to implement these requirements. So I think we had a lot of buy-in that way, by seeing them as partners rather than adversaries. And I think that helped a lot. At one point, I think we had every state participating except one.
I noticed the one, apparently Wyoming is maybe still the one. That's one that was a real headache for me. But we had overwhelming support from the governors in both parties. So we didn't have hassles, fires burning everywhere. We had fires burning in New York and California, Illinois. But by and large, people had been conditioned to know about these types of problems, and they could see these are some types of solutions that might, in part, address those problems.
Thank you, John. Ira, did you want to jump in on that?
I just want to make a comment. You know, when the reauthorization took place in 1980, we had groups like the National Sheriff's Association, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the American Legion. I mean, groups that typically had not been involved in juvenile justice, who supported the reauthorization of the act, and particularly getting kids out of adult jails. I mean, sheriffs did not want to have kids in their jails. They were getting sued left and right. So there was a lot of support from groups and organizations that you wouldn't typically find. And the other thing I want to mention is that the general political climate when I was administrator was very different than the political climate today. There was a lot of bipartisan support for the office in both the House and the Senate. And there wasn't this bitterness that you see in the Congress and in the Senate today. It was really a very different time. Now, fortunately, the office today still enjoys tremendous support politically, you know, but again, the political environment was really quite different. And you had, you know, tremendous Republican and Democratic support, you know, for the Juvenile Justice and Prevention Act. And so that really helped make it possible to get that reauthorization through. If it was today, I couldn't predict what the outcome, you know, would be. You know, maybe a coin toss or less. I just don't know.
Right. So we are getting towards the end of our time. We have set aside about 5 minutes or so for questions from the audience. So I want to give you all an opportunity to come forward or stand up in your chair area and ask a question. Give me a hand, and I'll point out the people that have given me a hand. Otherwise, I'm going to keep going. So I've got more questions. Anybody? You're going like this, but that's not a question. Okay. All right. So I have a question. I'm going to go back to the panel. And it really is a kind of a rounding it up question. As you think about the overall impact of the act, and then as the office being established by that act, with a particular emphasis on research initiatives, how would you describe your thoughts about the impact of both the office and the act itself? I'm going to start with John Wilson.
Well, it was always a challenge because we were actually, by federal standards, a very small program. And yet we had a responsibility to coordinate all the federal efforts. I mean, with HEW and labor and all these other outfits that had some peripheral relationship to our mission. And so that was one of the things that we really had to focus on in the early years of getting those relationships set up. And it's been ups and downs in that over the years. But I think that's one of the strengths of the office is going out and doing that. And working with the types of organizations that Ira talked about, they were very helpful with not only with jail removal, but with the 74 statute. I mean, we had a long list of national organizations that had supported the office, and a lot of that support continues to this day. So that was always a challenge. Integrating the new program into the state planning agencies and all that. We had, when the act started, we had 9 regional offices. It wasn't just straight relationships. Everything went through these 9 LEAA regional offices. Fortunately, that system disappeared after a while. But we had to reach out initially to the state planning agencies who were very criminal justice focused and bring them on board. So we had a lot of and one of the things that did help us a lot was, and John will remember this, there was a thing called maintenance of effort.
Oh, yeah.
When we were trying to get the program in LEAA, Pete Velde, who was then the administrator of LEAA, said, they want to know how much LEAA money is already going into juvenile justice programs, so I want you to compile that. So we put it together, took it up to Pete and said, Pete, we've got 15% of LEA money is going into juvenile justice programs. Pete goes, that's not enough. Go back. So we came back to him and said, no, Pete, we got 17.3% of LEA money going into juvenile justice programs. He took his pen, he went like, that's not enough. So we ended up coming up with 19.15%.
Right.
And we presented that to Pete, and he said, oh, that's fine, send that up to the Hill. Yeah. We sent it up to the Hill. The Hill put it into the legislation that LEA had to continue every year to spend 19.15% of its funding on juvenile justice.
We did that. Hey, and the Ford administration tried to repeal that section. And we defeated that 68-25 to continue the maintenance of effort section. And I'm just thinking, when I just started, I was seeing all we had to deal with. I was thinking I should have taken the White House job, you know. But although in my heart it was juvenile justice. And we had, if you counted the maintenance effort, almost $300 million that we had to deal with. There had been $75 million of carryover that hadn't been allocated for the previous 3 fiscal years. Just to put it in current context, that's almost $1.5 billion right now. So that was one of the challenges we had. But maintenance of effort, as John indicated, is one of my favorite topics.
Joke was on
tricky
us,
lawyers.
as it turned out, right?
As it turned out.
Ira, do you have any final thoughts? As we're in the lightning round.
Yeah, just a quick comment. Ever since I left the office and all during my academic career, I did a lot of research and published a lot in the field. And I was a member of the American Society of Criminology. And one of the things I have to say is that clearly some of the leading edge research that was presented at those meetings was funded by the office and NIJ. And that led to a lot of best practices in the field. So I think in terms of the impact of research, I think it's been monumental and has had a huge impact on the field and continues to do so today.
Thank you, Ira. John, final comment?
Yeah, I had just rediscovered a couple comments from the New York Times about the JD Act. One of them in 2007 was the JJDP created a far-sighted partnership between the federal government and the states that agreed to remove the barbaric juvenile justice systems in exchange for federal aid. The other one was in 2014, which would have been, the 40th birthday. There are a few bright spots in America's four-decade incarceration boom, but one enduring success, unlike the wasted money and ruined lives, has been the JJDP Act. Those are both editorial comments, one in 07, one in 2 in 14.
That's a great way to end this panel, right?
Impact.
Please join me in thanking our panelists. We're going to move on to the next panel. I'm hoping to get voted back on the island for this one. We'll see.
All right, so I guess I'm now voted off the island. And Shay, I left my phones there. If anybody calls, just let me
I
know.
remember going to a hearing with them.
So I think The mic is on, I think. Oh, look at this. Anna's going to time me. Well, okay. So I think this was a great setup, right? The history that John and Ira bring, the act and establishing the act, which has really been the foundation of OJJDP. So I get to moderate a panel that picks up, now that we're into having the act established, the next two administrations. That was kind of decades. This is really the Clinton administration and the Bush II administration. So we started the Clinton administration with John as our acting administrator, followed by Shay coming in, and then the Bush administration had Bob Flores. And so it's kind of great because Bob and Shay were the two longest serving administrators, both logging over 6 years. So cover a lot of ground with just 3 people. So, so a little different. I don't want to go back to as much to the act, but get more into some of the specifics that took place during your tenures. And John, you kind of crossed from the beginning to the end, because after Shay left, you filled in again as acting before Bob came in. So research. I came in to JJ in a research position, so I really enjoy hearing about the research. And you did a lot of work in establishing programs in OJJDP, but the comprehensive strategy was one that you did. And kind of talk about the research that went into that and the thinking behind establishing that program.
Well, back in the mid to late 80s and into the 90s was really a negative time for juvenile justice. There was this kind of feeling out there that nothing works, that we're about to be overtaken by a group of super predators who are going to try, ruin society and all this stuff. So it was a very negative time. During the 80s, every single state in this union toughened their state juvenile codes. More transfers, more direct files, all kinds of things to crack down on juvenile crime. And we went in a different direction. I had moved from the general counsel's office to OJJDP as counsel to the administrator full-time back in 1990. And so when the administration changed and I was made acting, it took a while to get Janet Reno on board. You may recall they had a couple of fits and starts on the Attorney General. And then Shay came in as an assistant to the Attorney General, not as administrator of OJJDP. And Buddy Howe, who was our director of research, Buddy spent 21 years, started with our first director of NIJJDP. He was at OJJDP for 21 years until we finally, in implementing the comprehensive strategy, we exhausted him. And he essentially had to retire for his health and moved down to Pinehurst and went to work for IIR doing gang work, which he now consider him the preeminent gang researcher in this country. If anything, I suggest that you read, if you want to know about that whole era and how we put together the comprehensive strategy and how Buddy, not so much myself, put meat on the bones of it by pointing out all the research and evaluation that had been done to show what programs work. There are many, many programs, from prevention to early intervention to sanctions programs, that are very effective. And Buddy put together all of that research. He identified all the promising programs that needed further research, but they had a promise to be effective. And he also identified programs that didn't work. Things like Scared Straight, and boot camps, and the like. So he made a tremendous contribution. This book he wrote and was published in 2004. So it went all the way through the comprehensive strategy development. So if you talk about the first 30 years of progress, it is all documented in this book. And it's a tremendous piece of work. He said his wife was very unhappy with all the time he spent putting this together. Buddy didn't come up for, I tried to talk him into coming up for this. He said, no, I'm going to go to the national conference. And I said, okay, you don't have to come then. But I urge all of you, when you go to the national conference, look up Buddy Howell and talk to him about OJJDP. And he was just tremendous. He was with NIJ when OJJDP was established, and we recruited him to be our first director. And I got to mention this too. Buddy was one of the first hires. We brought Emily Martin over from Community Relations Services, David West from HEW, from JJDPA, Doug Dodge, who was with the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., brought in Sharon Wagner as our administrative officer. And later we hired people like Betty Chemers, who's here, Eileen Gary, Ron Laney, Jeff, Julie, Janet, and so forth, who are still here, which is really pretty cool to see that continuity in the office. So, that's kind of what it is. And we did things like the causes and correlates research. Buddy did, and NIJ. I mean, I compare the results of the research efforts of OJJDP to what NIJ produced in those same years with regard to the criminal justice system. So
yeah, absolutely. It's a good time for research and a lot of groundbreaking research.
A lot of groundbreaking, yes.
So Shay, you came in, followed as part of the Clinton administration, and you came in from a prosecution background, which was really kind of unusual in the juvenile justice field. But you came in and you had to face the John DeLilio super predators, and juvenile crime was spiking, and everybody, John referenced, changing laws to incarcerate and be harsher on juveniles. But you had to take a different approach. You wanted to do something different. And what did you do? How did you go about that?
There was an intersection of a lot of different things that were going on. It was the age of the super predator and having to deal with that issue. But I want to go back and build my answer around John's answer. Because I think when Janet Reno came in as Attorney General, she had a very heavy focus on juvenile justice and youth issues more broadly, including abuse and neglect, the education of children, the health of children, the children who come in conflict with the law. And so when John and Buddy actually presented me, when I was still at Maine Justice, with the comprehensive strategy, which is really, we don't leave some of these things very long, a continuum of care approach, dealing with prevention, early intervention, and what do you do for the more serious crime. It was actually a perfect moment for Buddy and John to have scheduled an hour-long meeting that ended up being a 3-hour-long meeting, where I could then take that back to the Attorney General and say, I think we have a foundational piece that we could move forward with in terms of your administration on the juvenile justice side. And again, as John noted, I was not at that point administrator of the office. I was doing work for her at what they call Maine Justice. And indeed, Jeff, that became a hallmark of our approach, that we were saying, yes, you have to deal with serious offenders, which the comprehensive strategy does in its name, but also deal with the front end of the system. Where are these kids 3 or 4 years before that critical event that puts them in the deep end of the system? What are the things we can do looking at multi-systems approaches, which was a hallmark of the work that we did? And as John mentioned, we were fortunate to have people like Buddy Howell and Betty Chemers and others in this room. Kristen Crackey is somewhere here, who we brought in to really focus on this intersection of abuse and neglect and delinquency, to say, yes, we need to deal with the serious crime, but we're also going to be thoughtful in that kind of comprehensive approach in doing so. And what's interesting about the process, and this gets back to something that was said earlier about the way we dealt with Congress at that time, and the fact that it could be acrimonious, but it wasn't destined to fail. So you'd go for an oversight hearing in the House with Hal Rogers, and Congressman Rogers would give you hell for 15 minutes and then get into some serious discussion about what do we need to do to address the drug issues or whatever the issue happened to be. So I think that was a different era in terms of being able to move forward. And so if Jeff Sessions had a piece of a legislation like the JBIG program, a Juvenile Justice Block Grant program, that he thought was going to get tough on crime, he pretty much ignored the fact that more of that money went towards prevention than went to locking kids up. So I think we were smart in navigating that. One other comment was, and I might be wrong on this in my historical frame, but I think the administrations prior to the Clinton administration, prior to the Attorney General Reno years, were pretty much zeroing out the OJJDP budget. They were not really investing in it. So in terms of bringing the staff together, bringing other agencies together for an administration that was blowing the budget up big to invest in this area, we had a welcome platform to do our work in many ways. So JBIG, I think it was authorized at $500 million and appropriated at $250 million, was just a lot of money that we were able to use in smart ways. So Jeff, you're right. The environment was somewhat hostile to dealing with a developmental approach, but I think we were smart in how we approached it in a way to build a very strong foundation at the office that allowed our work to grow and to grow since then.
Okay. So, Chad, I do want to stay with you for a minute before going to Bob and keeping our sequential chronology going. You talked about the appropriation. You know, and JBIG was a huge thing. I mean, you know, doubling the amount of money that was coming in to OJJDP. The core requirements were always the bread and butter, right? I mean, that's when people talk about the JJDP Act, that's what we're always looking at as the states. There's a lot of other pieces, but that tends to be the thing. And the appropriation was going up dramatically. I mean, how did that impact your ability to work with the states? Did that enhance?
It's the carrot, right?
Yeah.
The carrot is there to say, we've got a lot of money now, and if you want to be eligible to get this money, you need to work with us. But I think, Jeff, it's also, and I kind of tipped my hand on this as I was moderating the prior panel, are you being viewed as a monitor, as an accountability agent, or are you being viewed as a partner who understands the work we do at the state and local and tribal level and works with us towards being in compliance in a thoughtful manner? So I think there were a couple of moments, John, where we had to deal with some states that were really kind of hostile to what we were trying to do. But I think it was changing the mindset that we're here to work with you, actually truly work with you and to understand, that allowed us, along with that carrot, to change the relationship with the state and local governments, that they were more supportive.
Okay. So moving along then to Bob Flores. You came on as the first appointed administrator with the Bush administration, and so crime had seen its spike and started to go back down. While the publicity and the press would never acknowledge that, and people would continue to believe that juvenile crime was rampant and out of control, we knew it was going down. The appropriation was still solid. So as you came on board, what became your focus? What were the things that you wanted to tackle within the juvenile justice?
I was one of the first nominees for the president, and it took me a year to get to OJJDP. And along the way came 9/11, and that really fundamentally changed everything in Washington. I have to say, the office that I inherited from Shea and from the Clinton administration was extremely healthy. There was a lot of money. There were a lot of different programs, and there was general interest in the field to work with OJJDP. I arrived in April of 2002, and the first week I called someone that I knew in the AG's office to make an appointment to talk to the AG, because I'd already met with him at least, I think, twice during the nomination process, to ask him what he wanted as a priority. I thought it might be helpful to find out whether or not I was going to be at loggerheads with the top guy, or there was something of interest. And I never got that conversation with the AG. What I got from my friend was, Bob, 9/11, the oxygen's out of the room. You just do whatever it is that you're going to do, and the AG will sign off on it. That's a blessing and a curse, because you really do benefit tremendously from having the front office at Main Justice aware of what you're doing and willing to continue to support those efforts. The other thing that my colleagues who are here today probably remember is that In 2002, the AAG's office started a management review of all of OJP. And so that was a soup to nuts. Booz Allen came in, there was a $5 million contract to take a look at everything and anything. And the goal, I think, was to completely reorganize OJP, move things around, switch components, consolidate different programs. And that's the environment in which I showed up. So my first congressional hearing was with my nomination hearing, and it was then Senator Biden who was leading that charge. He and Orrin Hatch were up there. And I know that I didn't get any words in because I tried 3 or 4 times, only to hear about his beloved mother. And it was all about girls. It was about girls being incarcerated at alarming rates. What did we know? Why didn't we know? Why was this happening? And what was I going to do about it? And so I had been briefed well, and I was just about to start, and then I realized I'm not going to say anything right now because it's not going to be well received. So our office did take on some really, I think, excellent research with the Girls Study Project. I think that was something that was well done, and it involved a consortium, which we didn't do all of our research with consortia back then, but it really brought in a lot of people. So 9/11 really changed the framework, and OJJDP was not at the forefront of anyone's thought, I think, in the administration for at least 2 or 3 years. The senior person was the AAG for OJP, and that was pretty much where the attention stopped. But I do want to say that I wish, and I hope maybe administrators going forward have an opportunity to just, maybe the office will actually bring together as many of the administrators as are willing to talk to whoever gets the next chair, because I'd like to kind of just bring these guys home with me tonight, have dinner, and then hear the rest of their stories, mine pale in comparison. But I will say that I came as a prosecutor too, and that was the other thing that people were not happy with in the field. We had already had Shay, and he was a prosecutor from Miami, and now I was a prosecutor from New York, and I had been in the criminal division for 7 years. So that was a second strike. But I read an article in the 1970s when I was still in high school, and it scared the stuffing out of me. It was in Reader's Digest, and it was about children incarcerated and what was happening to them and the kinds of fates that awaited any juvenile who was going to go to prison. And together with having a little boy and a little girl at the time, really, it just reinforced how so many kids are on the edge of a knife. They turn one way, they're going to have a great experience and a great life, and they turn another way, and they're in for a really hard go. So I'm thankful for the time that I spent there, but extremely thankful for the condition in which I inherited the office.
Thank you. So we've got a lot of things. I know we can't cover all of it, short time, but one thing I felt like I wanted to hear at least a couple thoughts on. OJJDP has a national coordinating council on juvenile justice, and it's been in existence, right? It's part of the act, and had various different impacts on the work. And I think, Shay, you particularly used the coordinating council in a very positive way. Talk about how you did that, or what your thoughts were about that federal coordinating effort.
Well, I mean, this is very consistent with Reno's belief that if you're going to be looking at a young person coming into the delinquency system, there's a story behind that trajectory that you need to understand. And the other members of the coordinating council are the Department of Education, the Department of Labor, HHS, HUD. So these are the places that a child lives and grows up in, and she understood that we needed to bring these people to the table and make the Coordinating Council a viable entity that could do some really good work. And I think Liz has really done a good job in revitalizing it. But Reno set the bar very, very high because she actually chaired the Coordinating Council. And when she wasn't there, she had the Deputy Attorney General, the Associate Attorney General, chair the Coordinating Council. So that philosophy that she brought about what Liz is promoting now, a continuum of care, is one that was really brought to life through the Coordinating Council. A master plan was developed, similar to the recommendations that you're making, and we tried to act upon a lot of those things. So it's a meaningful way to include 3 members appointed by the Senate, 3 members appointed by the House, 3 members appointed by the administration, and to give them an opportunity along with youth to make a difference in terms of the planning of that agency. So very, very strong piece of what she did. You know, Jeff, I'll use this as an opportunity to say that, you know, Bob says that we left the office really healthy. We didn't have a 9/11. You know, we had lots of issues with our president, but we didn't have a 9/11. And
So to speak.
is it?
Delicate to say.
But Reno stayed focused on juvenile justice. So, you know, there would be a direct call from the Attorney General to me saying, I've got some issues with BOP wanting to take more control around federalizing youth crime in this country. What are your thoughts? I need to talk about this. So I think that was known to the staff, that we really were viewed in a way that we were on equal footing with the criminal division and BOP and others in order to advance the work. So I have to say it, if it wasn't for Janet Reno, we would not have done the work we did. You know, we had a fantastic staff. We grew it to 110, 120 people. Some of those people are still here doing outstanding work, but it was her that said, you go talk to OMB and tell them what we need, and then I'll make sure we back it up at the White House. That's unheard of in any other administration.
So how did you navigate that? You know, you have the First Lady making juvenile justice a prime thing, but the Attorney General and the department is focused somewhere totally different.
Early the first year of my tenure, Senator Gregg's staff from New Hampshire wanted to find out how they could help the office. And the Coordinating Council, to me, was a great idea, but I knew that it would not be chaired any longer by the Attorney General, and I probably would not get too many cabinet secretaries there as a result. What they did, though, was they gave me $1 million or $1.5 million of funding actually for the Coordinating Council. So we actually had staff and we had the ability to do things so that down the road, we actually had a national conference in January, I can't remember what year, which featured Helping America's Youth, but that every agency that was part of the Coordinating Council got, I think we were able to give them $100,000 or $150,000, and they were able to run their own kind of series of breakouts off of the conference. So even though it was January, I think we had 2,000 plus people show up for that conference. I think the lesson for me was with a little bit of money and the buy-in on whatever you're working on, you really can make a huge difference. And so for us, it was trying to figure out how do we partner much more effectively, because I don't know if it was that case for you all, but I was stunned to find out that I was the nation's truant officer. The truancy was lodged at OJJDP. I mean, and that education, I tried to give it to them, wanted no part of it. They really resisted until we found a way through the Coordinating Council to work together.
So I'm at 24 minutes, 42 seconds. I think of my 25 minutes, but so I think same. Is there questions from anybody out in the audience that would like to present a question to Shay or Bob or John?
How did you handle the communication, the public narrative around super predators and the dangerousness of youth?
I mean, I think we struggled with it because the John DeLeos of the world had a big microphone. And so we had to be consistent in our messaging around what we were going to be doing and how we were going to do it. I think Reno was an excellent spokesperson in that regard, speaking well to, we didn't call it then at the time, but a developmental approach on those issues. I think we used the data, the numbers, as we read them, as a counterpoint to what Dulio was talking about. So I think that was a lot of what we were trying to do. And then our grant programs, Marcy, spoke for themselves. So we were putting a lot of money out, even under that juvenile justice block grant, which was advertised as, bricks and mortar to build prisons. And the grants that were going out and being used, you could track them in the system, were being used for early intervention and prevention and diversion, as much as they were, but you couldn't build many prisons with the kind of money that came out of there once it was divided out as a block grant. So I think it was the conversation we were trying to have, using the comprehensive strategy as a balanced approach in working on these things. So that's generally how we try to deal with it and be consistent. It wasn't easy. I was smiling to myself, Bob, when you talked about your confirmation hearing. My confirmation hearing was a piece of cake. But the time I appeared in front of Biden, and John will remember this well, was a disaster because of the very same issues that Bob was pointing to. It's hard to get a word in edgewise or to be right. We were wrong. We were wrong, and he was right on everything. We walked out of that hearing, it was like, what just happened? He's our friend. But it was a moment. It was a moment.
What is the single most important issue facing juvenile justice today? So, John, you get to go first.
Microphone.
That's a good question. Fortunately, we're not in a position where people are hollering for us to be tougher on juvenile crime. At least I don't see that. But I think what we need to do today is just to keep on doing what we're doing and doing it as well as we can, and probably better than we did back in our day, which I see a lot of evidence of that. Yeah. So I think that's kind of my answer to that.
All right. Bob?
I've always thought our culture has a schizophrenic approach to children. Under certain circumstances, it treats them as adults. Under others, it treats them as children. And then in some cases, it hardly even notices that they're around. So I will just share this real quick. My second or third year in, I was in New York, actually the week before 9/11, so it's very early now, it's the week before 9/11. And I was walking to a meeting, and someone from the White House called me and asked me who was the spokesperson in the United States for children. And I thought, oh, that's going to be an easy question. I must know that. And I thought, and the more I thought about it was, no matter what name I give, the other side is not going to be happy with it. And then I realized that really we have people who speak for portions of children, but not for all children who are under 18. And so I gave them an answer, but long and short of it is, I'm really hoping that over the next 10 years, we see somebody rise up who will really have a voice for people who are not adults, and that we will get a handle on how we want to treat our children, and whether or not we're going to make them into mini adults or we're going to keep them in different places and ways, children, adults, youth, who knows what else.
Yeah. If I can,
Final word.
A couple of points. One is that I actually don't agree with John Wilson on this one. We always agreed on virtually everything. But I think there is a threat to backsliding around how our youth are treated in this country. A fear that the headline cases actually reflect the norm, that we have an epidemic still of youth violence and gun violence committed by kids. So I think we have to be careful on that and to avoid the backsliding by being really focused on what I said earlier, the research-driven, data-driven things that we know are effective, and keep pushing back with the research and data on that what we're doing is right, it's the right direction, it does far more good than harm, and that yes, there are outlier cases we need to address, but we'll address those outlier cases as outlier cases. I just recently facilitated a summit in Arizona, a statewide summit on youth and gun violence in the state of Arizona. They had all 15 counties. I know it's amazing to think there's only 15 counties in the entire state of Arizona when you think about the election havoc that is wreaked there. But there's 15, and they sent teams from every county, and we talked about the real data on youth and gun violence in Arizona. So we had a national data, we had state data, and then we had every county's data on the actual amount of gun violence and youth violence in their counties, and it wasn't anywhere what they thought it was, based upon headlines. So I think, Jeff, to answer the question, we need to keep telling the story through data, and I'll close with one more anecdote. I tell this story many times when I do public speaking, and I always give attribution to Betty Chemers. So the fact that Betty's in the audience now is just perfect, because I can find out once and for all, was it her that made this comment to me? So when I came to OJJDP, I would tell a lot of stories about what I experienced in the field in Miami. And the anecdotal stories, they were just coming left and right. One time after a staff meeting, Betty came up to me and said, I love the fact that you tell the stories. It was a really good lead, right? You compliment someone before you criticize them. I really love that you tell these stories, but remember that data is not the plural of anecdote. Talk about the data, talk about the numbers, and that's how we answer any notion that somehow we're on the wrong track with what we're doing for our kids, because we're not. Was it you, Betty?
Someone said it to me, but I wish I could remember who told me.
But you said it to me.
Yes, I did.
Good moment. Never forgot it.
All right. So, well, thank you to this panel for getting us through the administration.
All right, this is panel 3, and this takes us from the 2000s to present. Oh, wait, am I on? Yes. Okay, good. And no, the light is on. Let me turn. Is that better? Oh, there. Yes. So this is panel 3. The years are 2000s to the present. And I have to say, it was such a walk down memory lane, because I came in 1998. So hearing John talk, John actually took me, I had only been here a couple of years, down to Main Justice for a meeting with Janet, no, was it John? Was it Janet Reno? I think it was you. And I was just like, I'm just a peon. But I was working on a project, I think it was the Tribal Youth Project, getting that off the ground, and you took me, and then another time, Bob, you took me down to Main Justice. This was back in the day when administrators and directors could actually have conversations on the Hill without having to go through layers. So if you were here then, you knew. Oh, thank you, Anna, for the time. But one of the things I think about as I was listening to the stories and just my time here, OJJDP has always been innovative, in my opinion. Innovative in terms of cutting edge. We are small but mighty, and we have a big bullhorn. I mean, we may not have a lot of funding or a big staff, but I feel like the impact we make is huge. And so, in thinking about that, so my questions are for Liz, Jeff, and Bob Listenby. Jeff, by the way, is the longest acting administrator in OJJDP. He was acting administrator for 3 years, and then came Bob Listenby, then Eileen, then Karen Harp, who's not here, then myself, and then Liz. But this panel is Jeff Slowakowski, Bob Listenby, and Liz Ryan. So this is a question for all of you. How have juvenile justice practices evolved since 2000 in response to changing societal attitudes and research findings? Jeff or Bob? I feel like Jeff is going to.
So, I mean, I think since 2000, that's the time frame we're looking at moving forward. I mean, I think it's a little bit of what we've kind of heard. I mean, it is the research has gotten greater and greater. I mean, when you look back, and John referenced the causes and correlates, research. I mean, it was the most cited research, done in juvenile justice. The three amigos who did that. I mean, there was nothing as huge as that. You had Ed Mulvey's Pathway to Desistance. I mean, that research really helped tell a lot. So during my tenure, one of the things that I, wanted to do is to try to enhance research. I came from that background, and we funded the National Academy of Sciences. Betty had left and was now at the academy and was the chair of our committee. to look at juvenile justice and the developmental approach and that. And so I think, what has changed is, that research just keeps piling up higher and higher, and it's getting harder and harder to not see the data and not build that into the work that gets done. But I think that's also a key part of, Shay brought up, the backslide. Because I also saw when I was in that position, there's always backslide. John talked about Buddy Howell pointing out the programs that don't work. Well, we knew that Scared Straight did not work. Not only did it not work, it was bad, right? I mean, this is like one of the few programs they actually evaluated, and it was like it had really negative results, not just not sufficient, but this was bad. But in 2010, there's TV programs highlighting Scared Straight, and communities are going back to doing Scared Straight, thinking this is good stuff. And so, there's this constant re-educating as we span a long period of time, so do the people in the field. New people are coming in, and they always come in thinking they have the next best great idea, and it's really the old idea that was proven it didn't work. So we're constantly having to do that re-educating, and so I think that's where I kind of see how research has kind of moved us in this couple decades.
Thanks, Jeff. Bob?
First, let me say to Liz, thank you for having this forum today. And to your team, thanks for organizing it, Anna Johnson, Cheryl, and others. This is really a great opportunity for me. I haven't really been back to OJJDP, as I can recall, since I left the last day of the Obama administration. So I'm happy to be here, happy to share the stage with my colleagues whom I've never really met a few of you, and to hear about how we got here. To address the question, let me go back and talk a little bit about my perspective. I'm a trial lawyer. I've spent most of probably 35 years in the courtroom dealing with issues related to, for the most part, juvenile justice, some cases adult matters as well. I came to OJJDP as a juvenile defender who had represented thousands of juveniles, who had supervised tens of thousands of cases. And I say that because when I joined the Public Defender's Office in 1986, there were about 16,000 petitions. As we went forward to 1990, there were about 2,200 kids in out-of-home placement. 2,200 kids in out-of-home placement. Fast forward to the year 2024, there were about 2,400 petitions, and there were about 270 kids in out-of-home placement. That is a dramatic reduction in the number of kids in the system, the number of kids in out-of-home placement. We need to recognize how dramatically the system has changed during the 2000s. If you ask anybody out there in the public what's going on with juvenile justice, their answer will be, kids are terrible, they're doing horrible things, the number of cases is going up, not down. Number of kids in placement is going up, in placement in jail, not down. We have done a lousy job of communicating with the public about what's going on. The risk of sliding backwards is great. The risk of sliding backwards is great because we've done a lousy job, we collectively, myself included, and I've spoken all over the country, of communicating with the public about exactly what's going on in juvenile justice. And until we change the way we communicate, we run a great risk that people are going to go backwards. I want to emphasize one other thing here. Juvenile justice has made great strides forward because of its research. Part of that research was recognized by the United States Supreme Court in Roper v. Simmons and a series of cases that followed. It is now the law of the land that you have to take into consideration adolescent development. I want to thank Jeff Slowakowski. He mentioned Reforming Juvenile Justice, a Developmental Approach, a book that he authorized, research grant, $1 million I think it was, Jeff, right, to the National Academy of Sciences. That book itself was the basis for almost all of our grants that we had during the time that I was an administrator. You had to read it, you had to understand it, you had to regurgitate it and send it back to us if you were applying for a grant. One other piece of research that was critical, and I want to mention, was before I became administrator, I volunteered for a year working for the Attorney General of the United States. It was volunteering in the old sense. You want to do this job? Yeah. Why don't you let us know whether you can really do the job? I was co-chair of the National Task Force on Children's Exposure to Violence. Attorney General Eric Holder believed in children. He had been a judge for a long time. He was trying to figure out, how do I impact children before they come into my courtroom? And he wanted to go back and find out what the issues were related to children's exposure to violence. And his initiative, the Defending Childhood Initiative, was an initiative that he put in place in OJJDP and across the coordinating council so we could figure out how to address this issue. So when I came in, I had the tremendous support of the Attorney General, the President, and others to try and address some really legitimate problems.
Thank you, Bob. And if you didn't know, Bob probably could be a Baptist.
POFA, right? It's an African term, and it means you have to look back to know where you're going. And I think that's really what we're doing today. So hearing this today, I mean, I don't know about the rest of you, but I could sit here all afternoon and listen to this group. This has just been amazing. So on the research, I just want to share a story, and this is before I came to OJJDP, doing advocacy work in the field. And as I think I'm a huge consumer of OJJDP's materials and reports and things like that. And I think it was around, 2005 or 2006, OJJDP produced a report about the transfer of kids to adult criminal court. And it showed that when kids are prosecuted in adult criminal court, they're much more likely to reoffend. It was like the report, and it had OJJDP's like moniker on it, Department of Justice. And I know I called Janet Cianconi and ordered like 5,000 copies of it. At that time, that was when you printed stuff. And we used that everywhere. We shared it with state lawmakers, with governor's offices, with practitioners in the field, and that meant something, right? And I think that it is both, for me, in this role, I see the value of the research and the products and actually putting it into a format that people could use, but recognizing something that I think Ira said early on in the conversation when he was talking about the 1980 effort to update the statute. There was a coalition of people across the country who pushed for this. And so I think that research alone does not tell policymakers what to do. It can be a very strong influence, but you have to have the political will. You have to have people putting that research in front of these policymakers. So I think the research combined with the advocacy with the coalition building across the country has led to dramatic reductions in the incarceration and detention of children. It's led to dramatic reductions in the transfer of kids to adult criminal court, and it's led to dramatic reductions in the placement of kids in adult jails. I think that it has had a profound effect, and that work that OJJDP continues to do can really impact the field in a great way. And OJJDP's brand actually means something to people in the field because they don't want to be out of step with what OJJDP says on this. Even if they may disagree on some stuff, if OJJDP comes out with these kind of products that say this is what the research shows works, people pay attention to that.
Thanks, Liz. I don't know how many times I've been to meetings, and I've heard this from my colleagues as well, and you're in a meeting, someone's presenting, and they're citing our data. And it's just so cool. And then you say, like, oh, thanks for using it. And they're like, oh, you're from OJJDP? So, yeah, our research it's pretty cool that we've been on the forefront of that. Liz, I'm going to start with you on this next question. What shifts have occurred towards more youth-centric approaches in juvenile justice system, and how have these been implemented in recent years?
That is such a great question. I mean, I think what we're seeing right now is a real shift in the field in terms of young people being at the table and having their voices heard in the conversation around youth justice. And again, something that someone on the panel said earlier about having kind of, I think Bob Flores, you said this, where you said there's kind of different minds about kids. And I think the solution to that is actually hearing from the kids themselves, right? Hearing from young people, there is such power in that, and it has such a profound effect. And I know for us in the office, we're trying to absorb every strategy out there to do that. Folks in the field are doing that on the state advisory groups and working with young people. And young people themselves are, I mean, this month, they are just taking Youth Justice Action Month to town. I mean, they have organized events everywhere on every day for this entire month, trying to engage people in the community. And I know we're providing some grant funding for that, but they're doing a lot on their own as well. And I think that really is something that is a profound shift. And it's not just us at OJJDP, really, we're following the field. The field's been doing this for a while. We're just catching up to everyone, and we want to incentivize that. We're looking at, what has the Children's Bureau done? What's been done in the criminal justice field, right, where you have more directly impacted people involved. So there's a lot for us to learn about this, but it's so exciting right now in the field, especially with, I think, the work that our team has done to really embrace and engage and partner with young people.
Thanks, Liz. Bob? Sure. What shifts have occurred towards more youth-centric approaches in the juvenile justice system, and how have these been implemented in recent years?
At one time during the year. But one of the young people that really stood out was a young person by the name of Simone Sanders, who met with us. And as many of you may know, she went on to become Simone Sanders Townsend, and you will find her on MSNBC. During the time she was meeting with us, she made it clear that she plans to be president of the United States one day. And so I would say that look around you as you're meeting with young people. There are many who are highly talented and who are on their way to becoming great spokespeople in this field of juvenile justice. There were many others that we met. You will find them on some of the different committees and heading up some of the committees. I've seen them receiving awards all across the country as I've been attending a lot of programs and so forth. The one thing I want to stress that was asked earlier, and I want to go back to your question, really, what do we see as one of the biggest challenges facing juvenile justice today? The challenge that I see straight from the courtrooms, dealing with juveniles who are charged with homicide, juveniles who are charged with gun violence during the gun violence crisis, is not a question of whether they're going to go to out-of-home placement, because I cannot, as a prosecutor, and nor can most prosecutors, send them right back home after they shot somebody. It's just not something you can do and still retain your job as a prosecutor. We have to find programs that will provide them with some means for rehabilitation that's progressive and positive, and it is not just warehousing. What we've done with direct file juveniles, those who are starting off in the adult system, is return probably over 90%, probably closer to 95%, back to the juvenile systems. But if we don't have places to send them, then we are going to have problems 3 and 4 years down the road. We've also sent them back for a term of years, which I received tremendous criticism for. I send them back for a year, in some cases 2 years. But the alternative is to send them to the adult system, where they would go to state prison. If they were going to get what's called a guideline sentence on the adult side, it would be anywhere from 3 to 6, 4 to 8, 5 to 10 years in adult prison. By sending them back for a term of years in the juvenile justice system, it saves them from the adult system, but it is a problem. Most of the programs in Pennsylvania have been shut down. Why? Because they were lousy programs. They were abusing and physically abusing kids, sexually assaulting kids. But we have to come up with some programs to replace them. I hope that OJJDP will fund some new initiatives to come up with programs. I know that it is not consistent with the general thrust of OJJDP right now, but the gun violence crisis has changed a lot of things on the home front for people like myself who are trying to figure out what we can do that's constructive and positive and still be able to address the youth issues. Adolescent development is powerful. People all across the country are learning it and studying it, and they're trying to implement it, but we need some new ways of dealing with that with the gun crisis, people.
So I think what I would say about it, I think the youth-centric approach is actually growing. I'm not sure it's so much led by the Department of Justice as much as I think other agencies have, more embraced the idea. I think, having the Department of Education, I think making more bounds towards not being the pipeline to juvenile justice, recognizing that youth are not, don't need to come to school to end up in a juvenile justice or a prison setting. And I think, some of the other federal agencies that we've worked with, whether it's on the coordinating council, have all, started to take, I think, more of an initiative around trying to treat kids as kids. And I think that has kind of led at least the justice side to be able to more easily adapt to that when it's not justice pushing the idea. I think for justice to always push this idea, and I think we've kind of heard it throughout, the idea that the data doesn't support that juvenile crime is rampant and out of control. But, and I kind of, been around a long time and working in OJJDP, I came thinking, this is a pretty easy thing to solve. We got all this research, kind of tells us what to do. We just need to, start treating kids differently, stop, sending them to juvenile corrections for nonviolent crimes, and we'll be able to do it. But then, 10 years later, everybody keeps talking about juvenile crime being out of control, even though it's gone down. So I think it's hard for justice to be held accountable to holding kids accountable and then taking that youth-centric approach, saying, well, we're going to, have them more involved and we're going to take a more lenient approach. I think when other systems or parts of the system, the social services and others, start doing that with us, it makes it a lot easier.
Thanks, Jeff. I remember we used to have a school-to-prison pipeline project that we did with Department of Ed. So anyway, what you just said made me think about this other question that I think, trauma is huge in the adolescent development and what we know now as a society and as a field. So what advancements have been made in addressing mental health and trauma-informed care within juvenile justice settings in this time frame? So I'm going to say that again. I'm coming to you, Bob, first. What advancements have been made in addressing mental health and trauma-informed care within juvenile justice settings within this time frame?
My sense is that having worked as co-chair of the National Task Force on Children's Exposure to Violence, which focused on trauma and trauma-informed care, the idea we had there was that schools and every institution that touches children should have trauma-informed people working with kids at a very early age. I have seen that happen in the schools in Pennsylvania, where I work now. And it is not as common as we want it, but people are aware of the practices, they're aware of the science, they're aware of adolescent development, and they're trying to implement it. So that idea has made a lot of progress in what I would consider a very short period of time. As far as mental health issues are concerned, I don't think we've made as much progress with mental health as we have with trauma and trauma-informed care. I think we need more. And I think we need better clinicians and practitioners available to children very early on. But I don't see that we made that much progress from where I sit as a practitioner.
Thanks, Bob. Liz?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we hear from young people really is around, like, the terminology has shifted from trauma-informed to healing-centered, right? So that whatever we're doing needs to be healing-centered, and that we need to do much more work upfront, much further downstream as well, right? So all ends of the system having more healing-centered work. I think that the National Academy's report and some of the research that was produced by OJJDP or in concert with others has really informed this. I think we still have a ways to go to operationalize some of this, right, and to ensure. And I think some things are an oxymoron, right? Like, we have all of these correctional facilities across the country. There are 30 states that are under some sort of consent decree or lawsuit over how children are treated in those places. So it's hard for me to conceive of healing-centered when you have places where children are being brutalized, right? So there's some contradictions that we have to grapple with. But I think that, again, what we're hearing from young people is putting more of these supports, services in their neighborhoods, where they can access them, at times that they can access them with the people that they want to get those services from. And I think hearing that and trying to operationalize that is really our task.
Jeff?
So well, I think what I would add to that, I mean, I think the research around adverse childhood exposure to violence, the ACEs studies, I mean, it really does highlight that incredible need for that trauma-informed care for many of these kids who have been exposed to things that probably a lot of us never even thought about growing up. We didn't think about shootings in the neighborhood and friends or cousins or somebody being shot or killed, but they have to deal with that. And And so I think I agree with Bob, but I think recognizing that trauma has gone a long way. I think we recognize the effects of it, but I'm not sure that the care has caught up to that idea. I think I'm not sure if I totally agree with all of what you said, Bob, only because I think mental health-wise, I think we have made a lot of growth in the mental health side. Distinguishing that from trauma-informed care, is a very specific part of mental health. I think generally, at least in my experience, there's, kids and the availability of mental health is generally more accepted, at least my kids, and that may not be it may be more of an anecdote. All of their friends sit around talking about who's your therapist, where are you going? And when I grew up, nobody talked about it because virtually nobody did it. I mean, so it's a different. I think it's more accepted, and I think the trauma part has to catch up to that still.
Yeah. Liz.
Cheryl, if I could add, one avenue that OJJDP used during my administration was this. We work with youth and law enforcement to try and get law enforcement to understand the challenges of youth. We had a police officer by the name of Kevin Bethel, who worked with us in bringing law enforcement officers together from across the nation. And we had these forums out in Seattle. We had them here in DC and in other places. Kevin Bethel also went to the National Academy of Sciences to work on a report after Reforming Juvenile Justice came out. We talked about how do we implement Reforming Juvenile Justice, a developmental approach. His work with the National Academy of Sciences, his work with law enforcement and youth here at OJJDP changed him completely as a person. He is now the police commissioner for Philadelphia County. And what is he doing? He has decided that he is going to implement a new diversion program run by the police department, diverting before arrest. What does he do? He was at the Muhammad Ali Center out in St. Louis, and he had developed a film. He did this entire development of this film. He said, we should not, as police officers, be arresting young people and putting them in jail. It is traumatizing. We should stop doing that. And the star of his film was his daughter. And he was filming this film, and he was taking his daughter through arrest, being perp walked through the school, handcuffs behind her, put in a police car, pushed down head in the back of the police car. He put her in a cell for 6 hours, but about hour 3, he stopped. He said, Bob, I had to stop. I thought I was abusing my child. And DHS, Department of Human Services, was coming after me. Talked to his daughter. His daughter said, no, Dad, I'm okay. Let's finish this thing. We're going to have a really great movie. He finished the movie, and then when he showed it to police officers at the Muhammad Ali Center, we were doing a presentation for OJJDP out there, he didn't tell the police officers that it was his daughter in the film until after he had shown it. Then he told them, and it changed their perception of what it is we're doing for kids. And it's changed his perception. It's now changing law enforcement's perception in Philadelphia. So my encouragement is for wherever we can to work with law enforcement, particularly those who are at the top levels, to see if we can change their perceptions and their ideas of how to deal with kids, because I see the direct effect of one particular experience that we had here at OJJDP.
Thanks, Bob. Liz?
I want to go back for a second where you asked about sort of trauma-informed care and all of that. And something I think that has been touched upon by each panel is that there's been some sort of crisis, excuse me, or emergency or issue that's come up almost in every decade or couple decades, right? Ira, you mentioned in 1980, the change of administration and trying to get the bill passed. Shay, you mentioned the super predator era and the pushback on young people. And Bob Flores, you mentioned 9/11. And I think what we haven't touched upon yet is the pandemic, right? So I know we've done a lot and we're doing a lot, but I don't know that we really fully know the impact of the pandemic on young people and on their ability to access trauma-informed, healing-centered services or other things like that. So I think that's something, and so we've got that. And then we do have this, it doesn't feel like super predator, but it does feel like some states are pushing back. I'm seeing advocates shake their heads and or nod in agreement that there has been some pushback. And I think we have to address that before it gets too far out there.
Thanks, Liz. Important point. I don't see Anna in the room, but she did leave Oh, we are at 28 minutes. Are we good? Should we take questions from the audience now? Okay. Any questions from the audience? There are microphones in the aisle. Oh, Steffi.
How do you all see
Still not
the
on.
impact of social media and the internet affecting our kids? Because I see that as a humongous problem and change. And when you talk about mental health and what's happening with our kids nowadays, how do you guys see what we should be doing regarding social media, gaming, and the impact of technology on our kids?
I can tell you one perspective, which is not really the desired one. In law enforcement, what we do is we track social media. If there's a shooting today, somebody gets shot, we're going to try and see if we can legally obtain their phones or the phones of anybody connected with them. And we're going to track the social media platforms that they're operating on. We're going to download their social media and see if there's a basis within the social media itself to proceed with a particular case. A lot of times, and this is horrible, but it's true. I've seen it over and over again. Children engaged in homicides will shoot somebody, go and they'll have somebody else videotaping it. Then they'll go home and they'll put it up on their platforms over and over and over and over again. And we will then use those platforms as a basis for trying their cases in court. Many of our cases are tried with no witnesses, just video, because that's what we're seeing on social media. So that is what's happening on the law enforcement side. I don't recommend that as the solution for how to deal with social media, but it is one of the practical things that we're doing to try and reduce instances of violence.
So Steffi, I think it's a really good question, and I'm not sure I have an answer to what is OJJDP's response or role. I think that the evidence is starting to mount very clearly that the introduction of the smartphones in 2014 really coincides, and there's a strong correlation to dramatic increases in youth depression and anxiety and other negative things that obviously we know from the juvenile justice side lead to bad outcomes potentially down the road for those kids. But I'm not sure where OJJDP fits into solving that issue of a smartphone in every kid's hand and the constant attachment to social media and what we're learning to be a lot of negative ramifications from it. But it is something obviously we as a society and justice as part of the has to be thinking about that down the road, because I think there is a bit of a tidal wave coming. And I think that kind of ties, Liz, to what you're talking about. That the pandemic created a real educational gap. And again, we know kids who fall behind by the third grade, chances of graduating high school become less and less if they're behind grade level, in reading. And we got a lot of those kids coming down. And I don't know who's thinking through all of that to solve it, because it may lead to that, uptick in research, 10 years down the road, and we'll be wondering why. And we'll have to look back to the pandemic and see that, what happened when we shut down the schools and the kids were behind. So there's some real challenges.
I do think, obviously, I have an interest in the research that's being done, and I have managed to sort of try and keep up with it. I will know that the report that they're referring to, Reforming Juvenile Justice, was released in 2013. And at that time, it was on the cutting edge and has remained really the Bible. But there's been a lot more work done since 2013. I think OJJDP's role really has to be on the cutting edge, identifying issues, not to say that you're going to be the ones to try and solve it, but certainly raise it. I think the social media one is ripe for examination, for research, and the implications for juvenile justice. I think Ira's comment about AI, it's ripe for looking at what the possible impact of that is. What do we know already? And so I guess I appreciate the comments in which you have sort of identified kind of some future things. There have been some ideas here that I think are really important. And I think even after this, for the people that sit on this panel, because it requires a lot of thought to really be thinking, what is it that you see now that really you think will have enormous implications for the juvenile justice system, and raise them with Liz? I think it would be very helpful because you have the before look, you have the present, but I think you also have an uncanny ability to continue to look into the future.
That concludes panel 3. Liz, I turn it back to you at this point. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. This has really been an impactful conversation, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have, listening to everyone on here. So I hope you'll stick around. We have some refreshments and food, but I think our task today going forward is really thinking about what are ways we can continue to advance youth justice, and hearing this is very inspiring to me, and I hope it's inspiring to you as well. So thank you for joining us. Thanks to everybody who put this together, and we will see you around. Thank you.